Hi, I'm Hayley Victoria and welcome back to my crime and policing channel. In today's session we are looking at the case of Mary Bell. So Mary Bell, a young girl, committed some tragic, heinous crimes back in the 1960s. And as usual with this channel, what we're not going to do is look at anything scandalous or exploitative to try and, shock people into watching stuff. We're going to be looking at it through like a forensic psychology perspective. We're going to be looking at the reasoning, the rationale behind how somebody so young could commit such horrendous crimes. We're going to be looking at the Holmes and Holmes killer typologies and apply these to these cases and see what we can discover through this story. Okay, so Mary Bell was born in 1957, Mary Flora Bell. She was born in Newcastle, which is in the UK, north of England. And she grew up in like the working class area of Newcastle, the West End of Newcastle, as it was called. She had a mum and a dad and a dog. That's what it was like in her house, an Alsatian, mother and a father. Her mum was a sex worker, and through the case notes and stuff I've looked at, was particularly involved in like sadomasochism and things like that, which might explain some of the behaviour of Mary later down the line because of how she committed things. And remembering that if you grow up around stuff, you can be heavily influenced by that as part of that nature and nurture, which I know a lot of people have studied in criminology and psychology. Mary's father, Billy Bell, was known to be involved in like petty crimes and stuff, quite a violent guy. He was very tall, quite big, and the police officers who were on the case said that they wouldn't like to meet him in the dark, if you know what I mean. He looked quite tough. Mary was used to seeing violence in the home, so between her parents, and potentially had that inflicted on herself as well. It's also notes saying that she might have been abused by some of the clients that her mother had in the house as well. So this is Mary's childhood. It's not very nice, as it's bleak. She's from like the most working class area of industrial Britain. So we're going back to the 50s now, this is when she was born. And England after the war was in a terrible state, as I'm sure you all know, or you can imagine. So all of our resources have been put into fighting this war. And we were, although we're growing, we are coming back from the devastation that happened because of those long years fighting Germany and other countries. We had nothing. We're still living on rations for a long time after the war. And the poor, the working class, were very poor. And the people who lived in that same area where Mary Bell grew up have said that, it was normal for kids to go out and play on the streets, from being very tiny toddlers, playing with all the local kids. They'd only get one Christmas present a year, and that was fine. But they wouldn't leave coal in their bunkers outside, or they wouldn't hang washing up outside because it might get taken. They were that disadvantaged that they really did struggle. So Mary Bell and her neighbour, Norma Bell, not related, they were very good friends. So Mary was very intelligent, very quick, very witty, and people really liked her, like school teachers and things, because she was a little bit of a character, she could parry questions and things. She was very, for a very young child, she was very quick-witted. Norma, however, was a couple of years older than Mary, and she wasn't. So when she was analysed later on, they discovered that her mental capacity was much lower than that of her age itself. And the local kids at the time, in a subsequent interview and stuff I've read, I'll put the links in here because it's a really good documentary I watched about this case. And the school kids would say, if Mary told Norma to jump off the Tyne Bridge, she would. That was a running joke at the time. So she was very gullible, very malleable to Mary's whims. When she was kind of like you get like the heavy, don't you? You have someone who does all the nasty thinking and someone who does all the hard work. And it was kind of like that kind of relationship there. Norma was very easily influenced, and Mary was very influential, which is how we got to where we did by the end of this case. Okay, so I know a little bit about these two girls. So Mary Bell, like we've mentioned, is incredibly clever. She's had a very tough upbringing. She's been introduced and exposed to graphic sexual violence she's been a victim of this herself, potentially, but she has definitely been exposed to violence, to sadomasochism, to a lot of things that somebody 10 years old would never have witnessed or even know what it is. But this girl's seen all this, and she's very clever. Then we've got Norma Bell, who is not very clever and is very easily influenced by somebody else and quite, naive in this situation. So these are these young girls. So like I said, born in 1957 was Mary, but we're going all the way up to 1968 now, when she's 10 years old, just before her 11th birthday. And the local kids in the neighbourhood knew that Mary was a little bit different to everybody else. The local kids were scared of Mary and Norma, this double act. They were scared because Mary was very violent and she'd already attacked some of the local kids. There was a young boy who she'd taken to the sweetie shop with Norma, and they found him hours later wandering around dazed and confused and injured. But nothing happened. Nobody, although they knew that Mary had done it, nothing happened about that. Not long after, a young girl had been pinned down by Norma at Mary's request and had sand shoved down her throat to try and strangle her. She was strangling her and putting sand in her mouth. Norma was scared by it. The victim has mentioned this in an interview, that she didn't think that Norma understood what she was doing, and when she saw that, she jumped up, giving her enough freedom for her to escape. She went back and told the parents what happened. The police were called, but she didn't tell them about the sand. She was still so fearful that maybe she would have repercussions again, or they'd get her again. So they didn't tell her about the sand. And the poor victim, bless her, said it haunted her after that, from what the subsequent actions happened afterwards. Some of the peers at school, so the school that Mary went to, said that she had these beautiful blue eyes, and that they'd know that if she was staring at them, that they were going to get it. They were going to get attacked, and she'd stare, and then she'd shake her head, she'd shake a little bit, and then she'd attack people. That she'd strangle people, she would injure them. And she put a cigarette out on a girl's face at school, and the teacher called her in and said, did you put a cigarette out on this girl's face? And she quite calm was like, yeah, yes I did. And he was like, do you feel sorry for it? Have you got any remorse? And she's like, yes, I have. And he said he was very confused by it. This startlingly demure little girl was capable of doing such things, but none of these actions were followed up on. I mean, now in today's society, anything like that happened at school, you'd be straight onto the services, wouldn't you? Like, whoa, safeguarding. But this is 1968 we're talking about, and obviously the years leading up to this, when it became such a fact that Mary and Norma were feared by all the school kids in the area as being scary and dangerous, and that they'd hurt people. They knew this. So it was of no surprise if we look at things like the Holmes and Holmes serial killer typologies, and we look at the thrill seekers. So your thrill seekers are the ones who like the challenge. They like the kick that they get out of taking somebody's life, or the adrenaline rush of it. Kind of like the power and control as well. They are the link between dead and alive. And it has been said as well that Mary had strangled a pigeon, she'd killed a bird prior to this. When we've looked at other cases, we've seen how people start small. They'll start with hurting animals and things, or inflicting pain on themselves, and younger children who couldn't possibly fight back, people they could overpower. So we're looking at the thrill of it, the enjoyment out of it. That's your thrill seekers, or your hedonistic style. And also the power and control, because they've got power over this. Maybe in Mary's life, because she's got no control at home, we know that's horrendous. This is how she regains that power. Now it escalates as these cases do, and this takes us to the 25th of May in 1968, which is the day before Mary's 11th birthday. Now in the UK, the age of criminal responsibility is 10 years old. That means from the age of 10, you're accountable for your actions in criminal law, that you are old enough to know right from wrong. You know what is good and what is bad, and what you shouldn't be doing. That is the age of criminal responsibility in the UK, and that's different all over the world. But in the UK, it's 10. So, just bear that in mind at the ages we're looking at here. She's already 10. It's just the day before her 11th birthday, and they found a young boy 4-year-old Martin Brown in a derelict house in the areas they lived in. So this area in Newcastle, I mentioned the west end of Newcastle, like, it was bad. They called them the slums, where people lived. And these houses were being in the middle of being knocked down so that high-rise flats could be built up, which were, you know, a predominant view over working class Britain from these times up until very recently. So they were pulling down these derelict houses and, you know, building other ones. But children saw these derelict houses as a bit of a playground. And I remember myself growing up in the 1980s and 90s in England, where you'd have these houses that were derelict and kids would go and play in them and mess them up and throw bricks through windows and stuff like that. And it was no different there. And as I mentioned, children, very young children, would be out playing with the older kids, but they'd all kind of look after each other. It wasn't that the parents were just like not bothered. It was these bigger kids have got these little kids, they're going to look after him, and all the other parents would keep an eye out on all the other kids. It's just the kind of place it was. It was quite a close community, and they all kind of looked after each other prior to these horrendous acts that were going to follow. So like I mentioned, the little boy was found May 25th, 1968. And that was little Martin Brown. And they found him in one of these derelict houses in one of the rooms upstairs. And, well, his mum had got a knock on the door saying Martin's been injured in the houses. And she ran over to go and see, obviously, if he's okay. And there she said there was a gentleman, like a workman, was holding him, and he was upset, tearful, holding this little boy. And he was only 4, bless him. He was quite tall for his age, a gorgeous looking boy, you know, curly hair. And she said he was really, really cheeky, quite a little lad. She says he was no angel, he was a little scamp, but he was a nice boy. And they found it when she got there to the scene. He was grey, got a bit of blood coming out of his mouth, but she didn't think he was going to die. She put his cardigan on him, and the ambulance whisked him away, but when he got to hospital, he was pronounced dead on arrival. At the crime scene itself, so which wasn't publicised, by the way, and this is going to form part of our evidence later on, there were some tablets found near him, but toxicology proved that that wasn't in his body. They'd just been left there from the previous tenant before the house was abandoned, obviously. And the workman found him upstairs. He found this little boy. So he was pronounced dead on arrival, and horrendous, as you can imagine. The police investigation with suspicious deaths and things obviously is going to start. Though they couldn't find any, initially, they couldn't find any injuries to suspect foul play. So they didn't have any obvious marks on him or anything like that. And they thought potentially he could have had like a seizure, he could have gone into shock and passed away because he got previous trauma from falling downstairs, and perhaps he didn't want to go down the stairs and he'd had a bit of a panic attack or whatever, and he thought he just died you know, through something like that. And, you know, the mourning process had started for his parents, were grieving, and his mother went to her sister's house where Mary Bell and Norma Bell were babysitting. So like I said, it's quite a close community, and all the kids knew each other, all the parents knew each other. And she said that Mary was asking her lots of questions about, you know, how are you feeling? Do you miss him? Things like that. And she was like, at the time thinking, oh, this little girl's very caring. She's asking me lots of questions. What a nice little girl. But, you know, as we've said before, in crimes and things like that, the perpetrators often go back to the scenes to find out how close they are to getting caught and things like that. So that's something to bear in mind. So the day before the funeral, Mary and Norma turned up to Martin's house, his mother's house, and knocked on the door and asked if they could see him. And his mum was really shocked, and she's like, well, you know he's dead. And she said, I know he's dead. I want to see him in his coffin. At which point, you know, Martin's poor mother shut the door in her face and just melted, just collapsed. They had to get the doctor out and everything because she was just so overcome by grief and, you know, a horrendous time she was going through. For someone to come and say things like that was horrendous. So not long after Martin had died, the two girls broke into a nursery and they'd made some notes. They'd written notes about how they had killed Martin Brown and I murder so that I can come back. Quite sinister, dark notes, which the police later on have pinned to Mary. They didn't think Norma got the capacity to make those kind of decisions. And yeah, so And they did admit they wrote the notes as well later on in investigations. So these really sinister notes, which were almost taunting the police because they'd not discovered what had happened. And not long after that, as with such things in such cases, another victim was killed. Because as we know, when we'll start looking at people's with these patterns, these killers, if they are doing it because they get enjoyment out of it or through the power and control, I'm undecided which one it is. I like you guys to help me decide here. Then we get to our next victim, which is again a vulnerable young boy. And again, this is in like the Scotswood area of Newcastle, the West End, where it's very working class, the same little location. And this boy is 3-year-old Brian Howe. And it wasn't until the 31st of July that same year that they struck again, and this time with the little Brian, who was only 3. And so, as usual, the kids are all playing out, and Mary and Norma led Brian off to a more deserted area called the Tin Lizzie, like an abandoned waste ground with like concrete blocks and stuff around there. And that was the last time anyone ever saw him alive. They wandered off, and someone asked him if they'd seen him, and he said, no, I've not seen him. But initially, the local area, we just thought, oh, maybe he's wandered off, he's got lost, or maybe someone's abducted him or something like that. The police were called, obviously, we didn't come home by about 5 p.m. And Martin's mother recalled how she noticed that the big lamps were lit. So they were obviously, the police were out searching the street, the dogs. She said the lamps were so bright on the Tin Lizzie's area. You could see everything that was happening down there. And they found him. They found poor little Brian Howe, because she asked, you know, what's happening? They said, oh, they found him. He's dead. He's been murdered. So instantly, the police spring into action. They call their SIO, so their senior investigating officers, down. They call the doctors. They call the photographers. We know now this is a murder scene from how they found this poor little boy. So they found him partially clothed. And the way he was positioned, which I'm not going to mention on here, you don't need to know. But they did find that he'd been strangled, so he'd been strangled to death, and he'd got puncture wounds that had been made after he had died into his little legs and on his abdomen. Someone had tried to scratch into his skin, so leave a mark into his skin. Now, the mark they were trying to leave were initials, which we later found out, which is horrendous, isn't it? And I'm sure you can guess whose initials they were. Obviously, it's a story about Mary Bell. They were Mary's. And at the scene, they found some scissors with a bent, so one of the, what do you call them, arms? Scissors? One of the scissor things was bent. So they found those at the scene, which obviously didn't close again. So now they knew they'd got a murder, but they thought from the injuries on this child, the person who was inflicted them aren't very strong either. It's not the same kind of consistent injuries you get with someone who was much like an adult or anything like that. They were only very kind of delicate injuries. So they knew they were dealing with another child here. So something has gone very wrong very quickly. It didn't take them long after, talking to other local children, looking at other things that had been reported, to want to question Mary and Norma. So their initial thoughts were, we think we need to talk to these 2 children who all the other kids are scared of. And Mary had said as well in the school ground that she'd strangled a boy. It's like, and she'd actually written as well. So that quite the Monday after they found little Martin, so previously, she'd written a daily news in her school book, boy found dead in derelict house, and how he just dropped dead, and there were tablets there. Like I mentioned, those details weren't published. And she'd drawn a picture of a workman finding him. So you wouldn't have seen that unless she was there at the scene. Yeah, it didn't take them long to go and talk to Mary and Norma. When they got to Mary's house, Billy Bell would not let them in. He wouldn't let the police in. He threatened them with this big Alsatian. So your Alsatians, like those, I'll put a picture on. Kind of what your police dogs are like now. They're lovely dogs, actually, but they can be quite scary. So, and I used to have one when I was a kid, really nice. Anyway, I'm digressing. So Alsatian dog, and he was threatening with it. You're not coming near my daughter. But, however, there was a witness at the scene. So there was a 9-year-old boy who'd witnessed everything, but he'd only got the mental capacity of a 4-year-old. So he wouldn't have been brave enough or confident enough to intervene, I don't think, but he witnessed everything. And he told the investigators that he'd seen Mary telling the boy that he had a sore throat. It's this little 3-year-old Brian. And she said to him, "You have a sore throat, I'm going to massage it and make it feel better for you." So she began massaging his throat and applied more and more pressure until the boy lost consciousness, until he died. Then afterwards, she'd mutilated him as he was already dead. So that's how Brian was killed. After this, the police arrested Norma and they arrested Mary and interviewed them both. Now, both of them blamed each other for it. They both said, "It wasn't me, it was the other." And Mary's encounters, her account of everything was quite detailed. She's like, "I just stood there like I was glued to the floor, I couldn't move." Whereas Norma wasn't as vocal. She was just kind of like, "Oh, Mary did it, she did this and this, and I was just there." And child psychologists got involved, and it was all very interesting. But obviously it went to trial. These girls were at the scene, we knew that. And fibres from their clothing were also found on the victims' bodies. So we know initially that they weren't concerned with murder in relation to little Martin Brown. However, once they figured out that a little boy had been murdered, they went and re-investigated that one and told his parents, "I'm really sorry, but now we think Martin might have actually been murdered by the same person that's murdered little Brian Howe." So obviously that more distress for the parents there. And throughout the whole court case, so they went to court as you do, and they maintained their innocence all the time. Norma blamed Mary, Mary blamed Norma. Through the investigation and questioning, they were under the firm belief that it was Mary who was carrying out the acts, and Norma was kind of being coerced into being there or to be doing stuff to aid that, whether it be holding children down or to be keeping lookout or whatever it is, that they thought that from all their investigations behind it, that Mary had manipulated Norma into being there. So after court, Mary was found guilty. Mary was found guilty, but because of the diminished responsibility, because they figured out through this counselling and this child therapist that she was a psychopath. She's got psychopathic tendencies. She doesn't feel the same emotions that a child of 10 would be feeling. So they figured out that, you know, she's not got there's something missing there that a normal, rational child would be able to process. Something is not right. And that's why, you know, she was found guilty of manslaughter through diminished responsibility. So she's not murder because of the other circumstances there. She's got psychopathic tendencies, and, you know, everything she's been exposed to as a young child has influenced why this has happened. Norma was acquitted because she had been manipulated into it, and they didn't think she got the mental capacity to be able to be responsible for the acts. Now then, I can't find anything about Norma Joyce Bell after the acquittal. I can't find anything, and I've looked. So if you can find anything, please pop it in the comment, because I would love to read more about this. After court then for Mary, they didn't really know what to do with her at first because she's a little girl and they hadn't thought about where they were going to put her. But she ended up going to this like correctional school where she's detained, obviously, and she's got to stay there. And she got affection and love. She was taken out of that horrendous situation at her home, and she thrived afterwards. She's not been known to commit any more crimes. She's got anonymity, so she will never be revealed to the public. You know, she's changed her identity a couple of times. Her children and grandchildren are also have protected identities because of the history. Obviously, it's horrendous what those families went through at the time, and the stigma associated with that for the future generations of that family as well, obviously, is horrendous. So after she was put in the care of the government, and she was in these correctional facilities, she thrived a lot more than she would have done if she was left where she was. And there's another video as well, I'll try and find it and pop that in there, where a young girl has been incredibly violent towards others because she had had that to herself. And she also was able to change and adapt, which is interesting again when we start looking at the psychology behind these things, the nature, the nurture. Can you be guided out of those paths? So Mary Bell was in these institutions up until the age of 23 when she was released. And like I said, she's disappeared into obscurity since then. But yeah, so Mary, 10 years old when she committed her first murder, 11 for a second. There is no doubt in my mind, had she not been stopped and apprehended then, she would have carried on and continued. And they probably would have got more and more and more graphic, as does with things like this. The police did mention at the time, she kind of, when they were doing the press conferences, when they were looking for the killer of these boys, she was there front and centre. And when they were talking about how the demolition wasn't happening properly and quick enough, she was there front and centre holding a placard, even though it was her committing the crimes. You know, was this some desperate way in which she thought she'd get attention, or what was she trying to do to committing these acts? These poor boys whose lives she's taken before they even had a chance to become who they were going to become. Because of what? And is it because of what she saw her parents doing? She certainly wrote a letter to her mum when she was in this correctional facility saying, it's your fault. It's your fault I've done all of this. Is that because of what she's witnessed her mum doing to other people, to her clients? But then again, if we look at the psychopathic theories and mentalities, it's your psychopaths and your narcissists who never accept responsibility for what they've done. So we're looking at that. This is a question I'm posing to you. So I want you now to have a consideration of this case. I'll put some links for a documentary in the description because there's some really good videos on this and some good news articles. Let me know what you think. And if you can find anything about what happened to Joyce Bell afterwards, I'd love to know. But yeah, that's it from me. I hope you found that as interesting as I do. And yeah, see what you think. In terms of the serial killer typologies, I think had she continued to, if she was free to attack again, she would have done, no doubt in my mind. And I think there's an element of power and control there because there's no control in the rest of her life. And that's where she's going here. But also, is it a bit of the thrill of it as well? She seemed to like the fact that police were looking for her, even though they didn't know it was her. She liked the fact that people were scared of her. So is there a bit of that? Let me know what you think. I'd love to hear from you. But in the meantime, stay safe, look after yourselves, look after each other, and please don't commit.